Hello, my name is Vesa Juvonen and I work as a principal consultant in Microsoft Corporation. In this demonstration, we will have a closer look on advanced HTTP posting scenarios as a pattern to overcome some of the limitations in the remote APIs towards SharePoint 2013 or towards Office 365. And this is a scenario or a pattern which we can use to enable some of the capabilities which are not natively supported by these remote APIs using client-side object model, REST, or any of the web services within a SharePoint. And the scenario and example, first of all, the code is downloadable from my blog post, and the scenario and the code works against the Office 365 on-premises or Office 365 dedicated. And it's not precisely something what we, let's say, promote or something what we recommend people to do. But every now and then you have that nasty customer or a demanding customer who's demanding certain scenarios which used to be easily doable in a server-side code, but now in this remote development world, in the CAM or app world, those capabilities might not be that easily available. So this is a scenario or a pattern how to enable some of those things which doesn't seem to be possible using remote APIs. And it's not a simple thing, and it's dependent on the DOM structure of the page. So essentially what we can do is that we imitate the end user behavior or what the end user might be doing from a browser using a client using a code. So essentially, as an example, in the Office 365 or in general in the on-premises as well, we don't have a capability to change the original settings on the site, which might not be a major deal if you are a US-driven company, but quite often in a global companies, the site which are provisioned, let's say from Windows Azure using some sort of a nice a site collection request tool, they will provide this local change option so that the site itself is available in alternative language or alternative locale, which affects, for example, the date and time formats. Or a alternative approach or a functionality which we might be able to, or where we might use this scenario is enabling of the languages within the site collection. Let's say if you do have, example, thousands of site collections and you would like to enabling this manually using the browser for thousands of site collections is pretty darn difficult. But what you probably want to do is that you actually, as part of the site collection creation, remotely from the Windows Azure or from the on-premises side, you will enable the alternative languages based on the availability of the languages within the sites automatically, so that nobody really needs to go and double checking these settings after the site collection has been provisioned. And after all, when you think of it, the end user can, the end user who's using the browser is authenticated to do these settings and is authenticated to modify their settings. So why wouldn't we be able to actually mimic the end user behavior? The second question is that why don't we expose these APIs using the client-side object model if the end user is authenticated using the similar techniques as using the browser? And that's a fair point and fair comment. And there's definitely there will be a new APIs available in the client-side object model in the future as well to enable these scenarios in a more, let's say, supported way. Because the pattern what I'm going to show today is not precisely recommended as mentioned, but it's an alternative when there's a critical need to do some configurations automatically. For example, the host web or the site collection which you remotely provision. So what we have here is a code example which is downloadable from the blog post. And in our code example, we have a structure which is based on or a solution which is based on 2 different projects. We have the contoso.remote.core HTTP commands, which is essentially the reusable assembly, which can be then called from Windows, Azure, or on-premises console, whatever you want to call that with. From the provider-hosted application, that's fine as well. And then within this example code scenario, we will be using a Windows console application to actually execute these particular settings. And that's for the simplicity's sake. So this is a really simplified demo on utilizing this advanced HTTP posting for manipulating SharePoint settings remotely. Let's have a look on the code. And this is essentially a example of the code, so that we do have 3 different scenarios implemented as a reference implementations. The request access request settings, which is for enabling that request access within the site, and that's the setting which we can see here. Let's go to the on-premises side as an example. Site settings, site permissions, and when we have that outgoing email access enabled, the access request setting can be enabled in here. This setting configuration, adding that checkbox and the email is not available in the CSOM. So we need to use an alternative trick or workaround to actually get that enabled remotely, so that you don't need to go there manually for every single site collection and put it on, if that's the standard way of the site collections. The second dimension in the code demonstrated is the setting of the original settings. This is a really high level demo. It only sets the original settings based on the local, and then it doesn't actually adjust, for example, the time formats and so on. So that's something, if you really need to do that using the remote options, you need to still work on that code. It's just a proof of concept of making that work. And then we do have the language settings. So how do we enable language settings in the site? We also, within this 3 different executions, what we have here, we also demonstrate 3 different authentication types. So we do have this authentication type option, which impacts how the HTTP request is controlled and created for operating these settings. So if you use the default credentials, we use the identity who's particularly executing that code. That wouldn't be a viable option in Windows Azure. But in Windows Azure, you would probably use the Office 365 option, where you then put the Office 365 user and the password for the user. And by the way, obviously this user doesn't exist anymore in this tenant, so you don't have to go and check it out. It's gone and doesn't have right permissions anymore. Kaiser Sose has disappeared again. The third option in the authentication type is the network credentials, which is essentially there if you need to impersonate. And this would be something which is useful in the on-premises, for example, towards Office 365 dedicated, using a classic Windows NTLM authentication. You delegate and then you set some sort of a super account, which is used for provisioning site collections, and that's also used for applying these additional settings. What kind of authentication schemes you need and what kind of models you need, that slightly depends. And this is just a reference implementation, how it can be done also towards Office 365. And I'll briefly run this through from the code. I'll just prove that it actually works. So let's enable the access request in on-premises. That has those 2 different options. Enable access request, set the email address to demo@contoso.com, and let's execute that one. It's done, which essentially means that if you go to that on-premises environment and have a look on the site permissions, it has been the access request settings have been applied, and that setting has been then posted for the particular site. The second dimension, or the second option, was the regional settings. Let's make sure that that actually works. So let's go to site settings. Let's have a look on the existing regional settings, and this one was the one which is just a proof of concept. We have the United Kingdom selected, which is using the kind of a European way of presenting times with a 24-hour clock. So what we do in the code is that we set the regional settings to be 2035, which is the Finnish. And let's move on and execute. And that's going to do the necessary operations remotely towards that site. And if we're going to go and have a look on the regional settings, we're able to see that the Finnish is now the locale for the site. This particular piece of code will actually fail if you're working against multiple different time formats and so on. So this is a pretty complex form or page to mimic the end user behavior, and I'll explain slightly later why, with a slightly more simplified approach. And the final example, what we have on the code is towards Office 365. So we're in the Office 365, and in this particular site, let's check the language settings. That those haven't been modified. We only have a default language of English and no additional languages applied, and running the code remotely towards Office 365 and setting additional language to be enabled. Again, I'm adding the Finnish using Office 365 authentication type with that identity, and that's the password for that particular identity. So everything has been encapsulated in this call. And this is a slightly longer operation because it does do a few additional requests on the Office 365 for the authentication's sake. And well, it's a remote operation towards the cloud, so it takes slightly longer. But not that long anyway, so it's pretty fast done, and we're able to go and check that the Finnish has been added as a valid language towards that site. So let's have a look on that, joonasharepoint.com/site sample site. And was it this one? Yes, it was. And language settings, and we're able to actually see then that the Finnish has been enabled as a valid language, because the language code of Finnish is 1035. So all of these has a specific ID behind of them to actually modify the things. So the things work. And how do they actually work and how they have been implemented? Well, this is now the kind of the thing why we don't necessarily recommend this option as the default development option. So definitely use REST, use CSOM, use web services whenever possible. This is your last resort, last option if you have a critical requirement and you can't actually otherwise achieve that. What we do essentially is that we mimic the end user behavior, and I'll present and show that one using the simple access request form. So what we need to do is essentially we need to follow up on the page, and this particular is the page named set rqacc_aspx. We need to mimic the end user behavior of actually enabling that and then modifying the entries on the page. And how we can do that is by first of all figuring out how the page actually works. And we can figure that one out for this particular page pretty fast using the fiddler. So I'm going to briefly start the fiddler trace, and let's actually follow up on what happens when we post that request on updating when we post the page update on the server side. So let's click OK. And that's now posted on the server side, and setting has been applied. I'm using Fiddler to actually to catch that, so I'm able to actually see what kind of information is posted as part of the browser operations. And there are certain things. There's this the Fiddler catches all of the HTTP traffic, but if we concentrate on what actually is sent towards the server side, we are able to see from the inspectors and web forms that the key elements are based on the ASP.NET also that the control button submit has been clicked, and that's the event target. If you scroll down, there's the requests on digest, which we need to know that it's properly done, because that's the SharePoint security settings. We need to have the view state and post that one properly. We need to have the event validation. And then we do have a few different settings, which in this case is the request access equals on, and the TXT email equals whatever the end user actually entered in the browser. So using this information, it's now up to us to actually build this HTTP post. And therefore, if we build the HTTP post properly, we are able to actually post or the changes, so we're able to mimic the end user opening up that page and then post that page using browser back on the server side. And therefore, the update will be processed properly. Let's use this. This is a good example to set enable the access request because it's a pretty simple implementation. In the implementation, we have the remote operations. So this is the base class, which will be encapsulating all of the reusable elements, and it's pretty dynamic. So it's actually taking care of the initial request, which is needed to get the view state and the event and the request digest. So that's the get request. So what we do there is that we request the page. Then we analyze the page request if needed. So we're getting that information from the page and we're able to modify that. We set the post variables, which is essentially we set those variables which need to be set for the operation. And then we post that information back on the server side. And as mentioned, this access request is a pretty simple thing. So in the real implementation of the operation, this is what we actually have. So it's inheriting the remote operation. It has some specific properties, what it's actually set, but it's actually inheriting and bypassing that basic configuration, which is target URL, authentication type, user password, and the domain, if those are set for the base class constructor. And then it has a few properties. One of the properties is the operation page URL. So which page is the one which is offering this option to override or to configure the site properly. And then there's those properties for us to actually set when we are coding against this class, like the email address option. This is, by the way, a good example of a functionality. In the cloud, we do have a few additional options for the request access, which are not available in the on-premises. So the on-premises only have the enable access request and the email addresses option. Good example of that, the fact that cloud is moving slightly faster than the on-premises. But then the actual operation is done by setting the post variables, and this is the reason why I've mentioned this quite a few times already. We don't precisely recommend this pattern because now we do have created a dependency on the page structure. Essentially, what we're doing here is that we are imitating the end-user behavior of clicking the browser and doing the submit. Now, if the submit control unique ID would be changing, the functionality wouldn't be working. So that's something which you definitely need to be aware if you choose to follow this route and take this kind of a pattern into a use. And the same applies for the text email text box. So we're able to use this, but now if the product or if the cumulative batch or in the Office 365, the structure of the page would be changing and the name of the control would be changed, the functionality wouldn't be anymore working. So that's something to be aware. Anyway, for this particular functionality, we need to add the button submit. We can catch that from the HTTP, from the Fiddler. We need to get update the TXT email. And that was a property which we can set when we're calling this object, and I'll briefly show that one. So we're able to actually request, create the initial object instance and set the enable access request and email address. And these attributes are then added on the call using a right identifier. And then enable access request, if that's set, if the checkbox is set, that means that this particular ID has to be set on. And then if it's an Office 365 and we want to set those settings as well, those are available as well. And that's it. Now, everything else is happening on the behind automatically. So only thing what we need to do is figure out what's the page difference on what are those parameters and what are those control names and options what we need to be posting. Everything else is taken care of by the remote operation object, and this is the base class, and like in this case, you don't need to worry about this one. So it's taking care of the actual initial request. Let's actually put a breakpoint in here, and let's walk this through so we can actually have a look on how it behaves. So let's run the example. There's the execute for the request access settings. Let's walk in. In the get request, we will essentially get the URL for the page based on the host, given the host URL or the URL of the site where we are operating against. We are creating a HTTP request object. Then based on the authentication pattern, which was given as a parameter for the constructor, we will change how we will manipulate that HTTP request. And this is where the Office 365, the required modifications for the Office 365 as an example are done. There's a model how to use fed-off cookie with the given identifier and the given user and a given password properly. And that's how it actually authenticates then against the Office 365. So as long as we get that fed-off cookie towards for the HTTP request as a cookie container, we're able to authenticate against Office 365. In this case, we're working against on-premises, and we want to do a default credentials type of authentication. So that means that we don't need to do anything more than set the credentials for the HTTP request as the default credentials. And then it will essentially make sure that whenever the request is processed, it will be executed using the particular user's particular identity, which is running the thread. Getting the encoding, we're getting the response. There's the response stream. If it's encrypted, Office 365 might have it actually zipped. So you have to process that one as well. And there we go. We have within the return string, we now have the initial request of the page. And this is required so that we get the request digest and the view state, and we get all of the required information from behalf of the end user. Good. The following step is for the analyzing of the request response. If there's any additional analyzing, we need to get information from the page, get something additional valuable on the page. Not required in this particular case, so there's no implementation. Then the set post variables, and this is where we actually move on that inheriting class to actual implementation of the request access request settings, which is then providing the required parameters and understands what values and proposed parameters have to be set using what kind of format. Good. Few settings, and let's add those. And then it's a matter of making a post request. And this is where we actually then get that initial request and get the required information for the request digest, event validation, and view state for the initial request. And then those additional parameters which the particular page implementation requires. So if we now have a look on the post body, after we've extracted the post parameters, we're able to actually then see the same stuff what the browser is posting back on the page. So we have that long post parameters defined, and there's the attributes and properties, and they're encoded in a proper format for the posting. We format the operation URL string, which means the target site and the operation page URL. So we get the page, we do a post towards this particular operation page. There's the HTTP post request. There's the post. Is it an Office 365? Or if it's not Office 365, quite often the pages require this additional updated form digest. So there's a code for that one as well, which has to be added as a X request digest header. So that's additional security checkup for the on-premises. Then we need to modify the request based on the authentication scheme. That's exactly what we did when we did the initial request. Then view settings, and we do a posting. And there goes the post, and we get a response back, read to the end, we're closing stuff up, results out, and we're all done. And that means that the email addresses have been now updated back to demo@contoso.com within that particular site. So if we go to that demo site, which one was it? That's Office 365. This is the on-prem access request settings have been updated back onto demo@contoso.com. By mimicking the end user behavior and posting the right parameters in the right format. Now, mentioned already like 5 times, not a recommended pattern, only to be used when you have that critical requirement and there's no alternative yet for the CSOM or the REST APIs. So many of these workarounds or many of these settings will be available in the future as a remote API operations, because these are really similar stuff what we've been doing for years using the server-side code, and there's definitely a need for enabling a lot of these settings. That's it for the demo, and thanks for your time, and feel free to use the code any way you want within your code, within your projects. It's not a production ready code. It's a proof of concept how to do stuff, but it proves that things can be actually done, and it also shows nicely how the authentication works against Office 365 using the auth cookie pattern. Hopefully, and this was useful, and thanks for your time.